In this video we continue with our exploration of Plato's philosophy in relation to the Orphic Mysteries by following the account from the document available in the online library of Oxford University, titled Platonic Mysteries, The Orphic Seeds of Plato's Philosophy by Cristiana Sessini. I decided to make a few videos by following this work because, first, I like it, and by reading this text I came to believe that this person has a great understanding of Plato's philosophy, and I personally share this practically identical view, as it is presented in this work, on the connection between Plato and Orphism. The key for this observation from my personal perspective lies in the fact that to properly understand Plato's philosophy, we must look at it not by seeing it through the lens of what we would today call philosophy. Modern term philosophy is not exactly what Plato meant by philosophy. What Plato meant by philosophy is much closer to what today people would call religion. The pursuit of objective knowledge is a central theme throughout Plato's work, from the persistent questioning of definitions in the early Socratic dialogues to the investigation of the nature of knowledge itself in the Theaetetus. Following the example of his teacher Socrates, Plato regarded knowledge as the foundation of a truly happy and just life, linking the pursuit of wisdom to the salvation of the soul, as is evident in his eschatological myths. Consequently, establishing a secure and stable basis for knowledge, capable of overcoming both the relativism of the sophists and the epistemic challenges posed by Heraclitean flux on one side and Parmenidean monism on the other, became an ethical imperative for him. Plato's solution was to restrict the domain of true knowledge strictly to the non-sensible realm, relegating all empirical knowledge to the level of opinion. He argued that the objects of absolute knowledge must themselves be perfect, unchanging, and absolute. These purely intelligible objects, which he termed forms or things in themselves, are not accessible through the senses but exist as eternal, unalterable realities. Yet, how can humans come to know these non-empirical entities? Plato maintains that although the forms are independent of the sensible world, they are not entirely disconnected from it. They are reflected or instantiated within perceptible objects. Moreover, as he explains in the Phaedo, the soul possesses a special affinity with the forms. It is invisible and immortal, akin to them, and being akin to them, it is always in their company, whenever it is allowed to be by itself. This passage alludes to the time when the rational soul, purified from its mortal attachments, will be freed from the cycle of rebirths and permitted to return to its original dwelling in the heavens, where it once lived in communion with the gods and the forms before its incarnation. Due to its inherent kinship and prior acquaintance with the forms, the human mind can use sensory stimuli to awaken latent memories of these pure, immutable beings. Even while confined within the body, the soul can participate in this wisdom, though only to a limited extent. This principle forms the core of the theory of recollection, which underpins Plato's middle-period epistemology. Plato developed this theory in dialogue with the Orphic tradition, philosophically adapting key religious and mythical motifs. The theory also anticipates later philosophical debates on innate knowledge. It posits that a form of non-empirical knowledge exists within the soul from birth, buried in the depths of the mind, arguably representing the first theory of innate ideas, a notion later cited by Descartes and Leibniz as inspiration for their own theories of innatism. Given the philosophical significance of this theory, the question of its origin becomes particularly important. The notion that humans already possess within themselves, in the form of latent memories, the knowledge they seek, that is, that learning is actually recollection, first appears in the Meno. It is introduced to resolve the difficulty posed by Meno's paradox. How can one inquire into something entirely unknown if one does not know what to look for? And even if one were to encounter it by chance, how could one recognize it as the object of inquiry? Rather than relying solely on logical arguments, Socrates appeals to the authority of divinely inspired poets and religious experts, claiming that both priests and priestesses, careful in the explanation of their practices, testify to the soul's immortality. Pindar and other divine poets are cited, teaching that the human soul is immortal. It dies and is reborn many times but never perishes. Because the soul has experienced countless lives, witnessing both the world of the living and the realm of Hades, it has already learned everything. Therefore, recollection allows the soul to recover knowledge of virtue and other things it previously knew. As Plato explains, since all nature is connected and the soul has already learned everything, The act of recollecting, what humans call learning, can lead to discovering all other truths, provided one pursues the inquiry with courage and perseverance. The theory of recollection is deeply intertwined with the belief in the soul's immortality, here presupposed and simultaneously supported by the argument itself. Because these claims are framed as religious truths, the so-called slave boy demonstration is added to illustrate recollection in practice. However, scholars have questioned the validity of this proof, which Plato himself apparently did not consider conclusive. Critics argue that Socrates may have structured his questions to guide the slave toward the correct answers, and even if the experiment is accepted as genuine, alternative explanations exist that do not require innate ideas or the pre-existence of the soul. One such explanation could appeal to the brain's natural structure, producing certain tendencies or patterns in reasoning. Even if the demonstration successfully shows the slave's ability to recollect, its results cannot be generalized to all humans simply by virtue of being human. Consequently, the true foundation of the theory of recollection lies in the religious beliefs that Plato adopted and adapted from the priests and poets he cites at the outset, primarily the Orphic tradition. Plato signals this connection by presenting the theory with the same mixture of hope and hesitation characteristic of his eschatological passages. To understand how Plato arrived at the theory of recollection, and to what extent he drew from his sources, it is necessary first to examine other Platonic passages where recollection is explicitly discussed, providing a comprehensive view of what the theory entails. The most extensive discussion of the theory of recollection occurs in the Phaedo, as part of a broader defense of the soul's immortality. After hearing Socrates' first argument for immortality, which employs the principle of the generation of opposites to support the ancient doctrine of reincarnation, Cebes introduces another theory often cited by Socrates. This theory, if true, would confirm that souls existed prior to birth, the idea that learning is nothing but recollection, implying that the soul must have learned in a previous existence what it now recalls. When questioned by Simmias about how this theory is demonstrated, Cebes recalls Socrates' practical demonstration in the Meno, which shows that when people are questioned properly, especially with the aid of mathematical diagrams or similar tools, they are able to answer correctly on their own. However, the theoretical argument Socrates presents to Simmias is not merely a repetition of the Meno demonstration. It represents a more advanced stage in Plato's philosophical development, in which recollection is firmly and explicitly linked to the theory of forms. Socrates' use of geometry to induce recollection in the slave boy foreshadows the preparatory role given to arithmetic and geometry in the Republic, where a 10-year period of mathematical training is prescribed for future philosopher rulers before they engage in dialectic. Having established the conditions for recollection regarding perceptibles, for example, when seeing a likeness of someone reminds one of the person, Socrates argues that the same cognitive process occurs when one comes to think of the equal itself as a result of observing particular equal things. Since one can only recollect what one already knows, the soul must have known the form of the equal prior to performing that act of thought. Because no two physical objects are ever perfectly equal, knowledge of abstract, absolute equality cannot come from sense perception but must have been acquired before birth. From these premises, Socrates concludes that if the forms exist, the soul must have existed in a disembodied state prior to birth and already possessed knowledge of the forms. In the Phaedo, then, the two central pillars of mature Platonic philosophy, the immortality of the soul, with its corollary doctrine of recollection, and the theory of forms, stand or fall together. The origin of the soul's knowledge is described mythically in the Phaedrus, within the famous chariot allegory. Here, Plato presents a mythical account of the soul's prenatal existence and its original fall from heaven. Before incarnation, human souls lived among the gods in heaven, following their procession to the place above the sky, the realm of true being. As long as a soul could join the gods in contemplation of the forms, from which both divine and human minds draw nourishment, it remained in heaven. But when, through some mischance, it became filled with forgetfulness and evil, and could no longer follow the divine procession, it grew heavy and fell to earth, attaching itself to a human body. According to the law of Adrastea, no soul may return to the place from which it came for 10,000 years, except for the souls of philosophers, which can regrow their wings and return to heaven after 3 consecutive lives devoted to philosophy. Practicing philosophy is thus described as being in communion, through memory, with those things whose communion allows the soul to partake in the divine. The Phaedrus offers a more detailed explanation of how recollection occurs. Plato describes how the perception of physical beauty and the experience of falling in love can serve as a gateway to accessing the latent metaphysical knowledge that the human soul originally acquired during its prenatal existence and forgot upon entering the physical world. Unlike moral forms such as justice, the concrete manifestations of beauty are easily perceived by humans because they are visible. When a person beholds a beautiful body or face, the soul is reminded of the true essence of beauty, which it observed before entering the cycle of incarnations, provided that the soul is not overly corrupted. Because all forms are interrelated, the true lover, that is, the philosopher, can recollect other forms in addition to beauty. When such a person falls in love, the soul metaphorically begins to regrow its wings, or more precisely, the mind begins its ascent from the realm of perception to the realm of abstract reasoning. This section of the Phaedrus is not only about intellectual ascent, but also about spiritual purification, for the ultimate concern is the salvation or damnation of the soul. As Plato notes at the conclusion of the Palinode, if the better elements of the mind, which guide one toward a well-ordered life and philosophy, prevail, the lovers live in happiness and harmony on earth, and upon death, becoming light and winged, they achieve one of the 3 rounds in the truly Olympic contest. By contrast, the non-lover's soul becomes a wanderer on earth and remains witless below the earth for 9,000 years. This emphasis on immortality and reincarnation links the theory of recollection to its religious roots, as first introduced in the Meno. There, the soul's eternal journey between earth and the otherworld, and its knowledge of all things, is attributed to men and women who are wise in divine matters. These were most likely Orphic mystery priests and religious experts, not the wandering charlatans criticized in the Republic and the Laws, but custodians of profound mysteriosophical wisdom. Plato hints at this when he notes that these priests and priestesses can give an account of their practices, the same phrase he uses to describe dialecticians, whom he regards as practitioners of the highest form of inquiry. Plato also alludes to the sacred texts of the Orphic Mysteries, which emphasized hearing and understanding, as confirmed by the Davini author. Examining the sources of Plato's theory of recollection, if one sets aside its distinctively Platonic features, its integration with the theory of forms and philosophical love, what remains closely resembles the version ascribed to the priests and poets in the Meno. Because the soul is immortal and has lived many lives, both in this world and in Hades, it has experienced all things. Humans, however, normally do not remember past lives, though exceptional figures, such as Pythagoras and Empedocles, and perhaps other members of the Orphic milieu, claim to possess this ability. Related to the theory of reincarnation is the notion of the kinship of all living beings, found in Empedocles and early Pythagorean thought, though this is not precisely what Plato intends when he says that all nature is akin. A closer parallel may lie in Empedocles' idea of cosmic harmony and the Pythagorean doctrine that all is number, which some scholars have identified as influencing Plato's theory of forms. It is possible that a similar idea appeared in the Orphic Pythagorean poems mentioned by Epigenes, or perhaps in allegorical commentaries like the Davini Papyrus. The etymological interpretation of Hades as the invisible would have fit naturally in such texts and is referenced by Plato in the leaky jar allegory of the Gorgias, as well as in the Phaedo and in the etymological discussion of the Cratylus. If Plato understood the things in Hades, in the Meno metaphorically, this etymology seems to mark an important step in the early development of his two worlds metaphysics. Memory plays a central role in the Orphic gold tablets, many of which explicitly reference the water of Mnemosyne or the goddess herself. Its prominence has multiple reasons. First, memory functions as an instrument of spiritual salvation. The newly deceased initiate must remember the instructions on the tablet to avoid the bleak fate awaiting most human souls after death. Specifically, the initiate must avoid the first spring encountered, which, although not explicitly named in the tablets, can be inferred as the fountain of forgetfulness, and follow the path leading to the lake of memory. He must also recall the proper formulas to recite to the guards to gain access to the water of memory, or to the queen of the underworld, Persephone, to be admitted to the seats of the blessed. The link between the invisible and the intelligible lies at the heart of Plato's epistemology. It is not the notion of Hades as the invisible realm that Plato rejects in the Cratylus, but the fears and false beliefs that most people attach to it. For Plato, in the Phaedo and subsequent dialogues, Hades is the realm of the unseen, the realm of pure objects of thought, forms that cannot be perceived by the senses. Recollection enables humans, in principle, to achieve knowledge of all things, but only if forms are understood as its objects. Interpreted correctly, the things in Hades correspond to the forms in themselves, while the things here represent the forms as instantiated. There are no longer two separate classes, but a single class viewed from two perspectives, in themselves and for us. Finally, drinking from the water of memory allows the deceased to retain personal memories and, with them, individual identity. This continuity of consciousness is essential for the full benefits reserved for the initiates, most importantly individual immortality. By contrast, the souls of the dead in the Homeric afterlife are not immortal, as they exist only as ghosts stripped of all mental faculties. The role of reincarnation in this context is somewhat ambiguous. The Orphic gold tablets make little mention of it, except perhaps in one of the Thurii tablets, where the initiate, speaking in the first person, claims to have flown out of the heavy and painful cycle, likely referring to release from the cycle of rebirths. In contrast, Plato, quoting Pindar, indicates that initiates, those whom Persephone accepts for atonement, are rewarded by being reincarnated as glorious kings and men of rushing strength and surpassing wisdom. Elsewhere, Pindar states that to gain admission to the abode of the blessed, one must live free from wrongdoing 3 times, in this world and in Hades, a notion resembling Plato's account of the philosopher's souls in the Phaedrus. It is plausible that the geographically dispersed nature of the Orphic cult, combined with the absence of a central authority, allowed a certain flexibility of interpretation. Some mystery priests may have eventually claimed, to attract more followers, that initiation guaranteed immediate escape from the cycle of reincarnations, a view that seems to have become widespread. If the earlier Orphic tradition indeed involved a more complex eschatology, like that found in Plato and Pindar, then the instruction to drink from the water of memory and avoid the fountain of forgetfulness would also serve to preserve one's memories and individual identity across multiple incarnations, as Empedocles and Pythagoras were said to do. Naturally, someone with such an ability would be closer to attaining eternal salvation than someone without it. Empedocles, for instance, could declare himself an immortal god, no longer mortal, confident, like the Orphic initiates, that he would join the company of the gods in the next life. While this tradition does not reach the sophistication of Plato's theory of recollection, its essential premises, without which Plato may never have developed the theory, are already present in the Orphic tradition, if not explicitly, then in spirit. A similar idea is found in the Platonic myth of air, where wiser souls drink only the necessary amount from the water of forgetfulness before returning to earth, preserving some of the knowledge gained or recovered in their previous experiences, to progress toward enlightenment across multiple lives. The significance of memory in Platonic philosophy finds a precedent in the Pythagorean school, whose members emphasized memory training. Likewise, Plato's use of written texts, presumably including his own works, mirrors the function of the gold tablets in the Orphic cult, to facilitate the recollection of previously acquired knowledge rather than to teach new information to the uninitiated. It is notable that Plato's only extended discussion on the technology of writing appears in the Phaedrus, the dialogue most concerned with memory and recollection. This discussion is framed by a myth, likely invented by Plato, where the ancient Egyptian god-king Thamus critiques writing as a substitute for memory. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the souls of those who use it, because they will neglect to exercise their memory. Trusting in writing, they will recall things from external characters, existing outside themselves, rather than from within, using their own memory. You have not invented a cure for memory, but for reminding. What you offer is not true wisdom, but the appearance of wisdom. Having heard many things without being taught, they will seem to know much while remaining mostly ignorant, and they will be difficult to deal with, for they have acquired not wisdom but the conceit of wisdom. This passage underscores that memory and recollection, rather than external aids, are central to the cultivation of genuine knowledge. Plato's critique of those who believe they have learned without proper instruction, thus possessing only the appearance of wisdom without genuine understanding, is strikingly similar to a passage from the Dervini Papyrus. There, the author censures initiates who assume they have gained knowledge simply by attending public mysteries in the cities or by participating in private rites conducted by professional priests, without asking questions. Both Plato and the Dervini author rejected the idea that mechanically performing rituals or reciting formulas could produce a lasting effect on the soul. For them, true initiation required comprehension, which could only be achieved under the guidance of a knowledgeable expert. The most compelling evidence of the Orphic influence on Plato's theory of recollection lies in the soteriological role attributed to memory by both traditions. For the Orphics, memory allowed initiates to recall the passwords necessary to enter their privileged place in the afterlife, enabling them to transcend ordinary human limitations and return to the divine state from which their souls had fallen. Knowledge, or recollection, of this original fall and of their true identity as fallen divine beings distinguished them from ordinary mortals, who, through ignorance and forgetfulness, remained trapped in the cycle of rebirths. In a similar manner, Plato's Phaedrus presents recollection as the mechanism by which a philosopher's soul can regrow its wings and eventually escape the painful cycle, echoing Orphic language. Beyond the metaphor of the winged chariot, Plato repeatedly emphasizes that the only reliable path to living well, both in this life and the next, lies in the proper practice of philosophy. This involves turning inward, away from bodily concerns and sense perception, and accessing the latent knowledge buried within the soul, memories of its existence in a pure, divine state in the realm of forms, untainted by matter. Plato's conception of immortality, however, differs fundamentally from the Orphic hope of personal survival. Whereas the Orphics sought the continuation of individual identity, Plato envisions a state in which the divine, rational part of the soul attains direct contemplation of eternal truths, a condition achievable only by the intellect, completely detached from the body and any material residue, and thus entirely depersonalized. Although the connection between recollection and the soul's immortality is already established in the Meno, the full soteriological implications of the theory emerge only in the Phaedo and Phaedrus. Whether this is due to the context of the earlier dialogue, or to the fact that Plato had not yet fully elaborated the theory within the broader framework of his philosophy, it is clear that the accounts in the later dialogues are thoroughly Platonic. Whatever inspiration he drew from the Orphics, Plato transformed it entirely, presenting recollection no longer as a doctrine heard from another source, as in the Meno, but as an integral part of his own philosophical system. If recollection holds such a central place in Plato's philosophy, one might wonder why it is only explicitly addressed in 3 middle-period dialogues, or in the case of the Meno, a transitional dialogue. Scholars have long debated this question, offering divergent interpretations. Some emphasize the continuity between epistemological ideas in the middle and late dialogues, while others argue that Plato eventually abandoned recollection in favor of a different model of knowledge. A minority of scholars even dismiss the theory of recollection as a serious epistemological account, citing perceived inconsistencies among the Meno, Phaedo, and Phaedrus. The view stressing continuity appears most convincing, both because later dialogues contain no statements that contradict recollection and because numerous passages, across both middle and late dialogues, implicitly presuppose it. For instance, striking parallels exist between Diotimus' speech in the Symposium and the allegory of the cave in the Republic, on one hand, and the Phaedrus's description of the soul's vision of true being and recollection of the form of beauty, on the other, passages all rich in mystical imagery and terminology. The Timaeus also echoes this framework, describing newly created human souls set in a star, as if in a chariot, shown the nature of the universe before being sent to earth for incarnation. Even the Theaetetus, which contains neither a discussion of recollection nor a positive theory of knowledge, shares a conceptual link to dialogues where recollection is central, particularly in its sharp critique of sense perception as a source of knowledge or opinion. Recollection, after all, arose to replace empirical theories like Protagorean relativism and Heraclitean flux theory with a more stable mode of inquiry, one independent of the senses. For Plato, the only foundation for such a method is the theory of forms. Without recollection, The human intellect cannot access the forms in its embodied state. To reject recollection is, effectively, to reject the forms and much of Plato's mature philosophical system. Although the theory of recollection is ultimately the product of Plato's own genius, it could not have been conceived without the prior influence of the Orphics, who emphasized memory, immortality, and the soul-body dualism. The fact that a core philosophical theory rests on religious belief may seem at odds with modern notions of philosophy as a strictly logical discipline, but for Plato and his contemporaries, this would not have been problematic. Philosophers were modeled on figures such as Parmenides and Empedocles, whose poetic works were steeped in religious and mystical imagery. Understanding Plato's doctrines, therefore, requires interpreting them within the intellectual and cultural context of the author and his 4th century BC audience. Even though the forms are instantiated in sensible reality, the human intellect would scarcely be able to recognize them, particularly the moral forms, without some inbuilt frame of reference. This implies that a form of innatism or prenatalism is necessary for the theory of forms to be epistemologically viable. One might describe this philosophical structure as resting on twin pillars: the immortality and divinity of the rational soul, and the reality and indestructibility of the objects of its knowledge, with the doctrine of recollection serving as the architrave connecting them. It is not difficult to see how a dualistic worldview, which positions the body and life on earth as sources of falsehood and the soul and the afterlife as aligned with truth, would lead Plato to associate forgetfulness and ignorance with the present life, and memory and wisdom with a reality beyond human dependency on sense perception. Explaining the nature of the forms, as well as their relationships to the phenomenal world and to one another, has been a central aim of Plato's philosophical project since his early maturity. Because he deliberately refrained from writing a systematic treatise of his doctrines, there is no single dialogue containing a comprehensive discussion of the forms. Instead, different dialogues explore different facets of the theory depending on their focus. This has prompted some scholars to argue that Plato never developed a fully systematic theory of forms, or that his understanding of them evolved significantly over time. A related debate concerns the extent to which he remained committed to the forms in his later years. Critics who suggest that Plato abandoned his middle period views often point to the critiques in the Parmenides, while those defending the unity of his metaphysics emphasize the presence of the forms in later dialogues, especially the Timaeus. Another contentious issue involves the supposed body of unwritten doctrines and their relation to the metaphysical theories presented in the dialogues. These and other questions about the development and meaning of the forms exceed the scope of this study. As in previous discussions, the focus here is on Plato's transposition of Orphic ideas and mythical imagery to illuminate his philosophy. In particular, attention will be given to the theme of binary opposition in Plato's treatment of the forms and to the famous, and equally complex, allegory of the cave. When discussing the forms, Plato rarely offers simple or direct definitions. More often, he clarifies what a form is by showing what it is not, either by contrasting forms with particulars or by placing a specific form, or its instances, alongside instances of its opposite. This approach may arise from the limitations of human cognition, which typically requires that inquiry begin with the concrete and the particular. Since the world of particulars is marked by multiplicity and contradiction, it is often easier to define something by contrasting it with something different. On a deeper level, however, this method of opposites is grounded in the dualistic framework Plato inherited from the Orphic tradition, both directly and through earlier thinkers such as Parmenides, and it forms the foundation of Platonic metaphysics. Pairs of opposites are especially prominent in passages where Plato treats the forms in detail. For example, in the Republic, Socrates explains the distinction between lovers of sounds and sights and the lover of the spectacle of truth, meaning the philosopher. Since beauty is the opposite of ugliness, they are two, and since they are two, each of them is one. The same reasoning applies to justice and injustice, good and evil, and all the forms. Each is one in itself, but appears in a multiplicity of manifestations through its communion with actions, bodies, and with each other. Unlike the lovers of sounds and sights, the philosopher understands that each beautiful perceptible participates in the form of beauty. Consequently, the multiplicity of phenomena is an illusion, Only the philosopher is truly awake, while everyone else lives in a dreamlike state, mistaking appearances for the reality they resemble. Since this truth is difficult to convey to someone not already aware of it, concrete examples are necessary. In this context, pairs of opposites are particularly useful, as they allow one to conceptualize pure, unmixed qualities, such as the beautiful itself or the just itself, by contrasting them with their negation. Although in the sensible world different and even opposite qualities often coexist, and the same quality may appear in various ways, each form is a distinct, singular entity that exists independently. For instance, the form of beauty, as the opposite of ugliness, must be a single entity, because something cannot have more than one opposite. It is entirely separate from ugliness, for nothing can be itself and its opposite at the same time. This point is further illustrated in the Phaedo, where Socrates compares height to explain the relationship between greatness and smallness. Simmias is taller than Socrates, but shorter than Phaedo, and so can be described as both tall and short relative to the others. Although Simmias participates in both greatness and smallness, these opposites remain distinct. Greatness itself will never be simultaneously great and small, and the greatness within us will never admit the small or allow itself to be exceeded. Similarly, smallness in us will never become or be great, nor will any other opposite ever simultaneously become its own contrary. It either vanishes or ceases in the process of change. In this way, Plato demonstrates that while opposites may appear together in the sensible world, each form retains its singular, immutable nature. Socrates clarifies that this does not contradict what was said earlier in the dialogue regarding the generation of opposites from opposites, because that argument applies only to concrete things which possess opposite qualities and are named after them. The qualities themselves, the forms, can never be or become their own opposite. The principle of non-contradiction thus applies not only to a form and its opposite, but also to a form and the opposites of other forms to which it is fundamentally linked. For example, the form of fire can never admit cold within itself, because it contains the form of heat. Similarly, the number 3, like any other odd number, can never admit the idea of evenness, despite not being the direct opposite of even. This is why the soul, which brings life to anything it inhabits, can never admit the idea of death and is therefore immortal by its very nature. Binary opposition plays a prominent role in many presocratic philosophies, particularly that of Heraclitus, whose doctrine significantly influenced Plato. Many of his fragments deal with what is known as the unity of opposites, a principle within the doctrine of flux stating that opposites constantly transform into one another in an endless cycle of change. Plato presents this argument in the Phaedo as one of the proofs for the soul's immortality, asking whether anything is the opposite of living, like sleeping is the opposite of being awake, and whether being dead is the opposite of being alive. If these are opposites, he argues, they are generated from each other. Being awake arises from sleeping, sleeping arises from being awake, and being dead arises from being alive and vice versa. Among the many pairs of opposites discussed, such as beautiful and ugly, just and unjust, greater and lesser, stronger and weaker, slower and faster, better and worse, the most relevant for this argument are awake and asleep, living and dead. Heraclitus similarly states that within what is living and dead, awake and asleep, young and old, these elements continuously change into one another, a reflection of Orphic influence. It is no coincidence that the Phaedo section echoing this Heraclitean idea begins with a reference to an ancient discourse describing how the souls of the dead pass from the world of the living to the world of the dead and back to earth, being born from the dead, a clear nod to Orphic doctrine. Empedocles, perhaps the most Orphic among the presocratic philosophers, based his cosmology on the cyclical interaction of two opposing forces, love and strife, acting upon 4 elements or roots, some of which he linked to specific pairs of opposites. For instance, he described the sun, representing fire, as bright and hot, and rain, representing water, as dark and cold. Similarly, Parmenides, another philosopher with strong Orphic affinities, built his cosmology on opposing principles. In his doxa, he identifies fire, or light, and night as the 2 opposite principles responsible for the origin of the visible world. Aristotle reports that the Pythagoreans recognized 10 pairs of opposites as the foundational principles of reality: limit and unlimited, odd and even, one and multitude, right and left, male and female, rest and motion, straight and crooked, light and darkness, good and bad, square and oblong. Although some scholars suggest that Aristotle's version may reflect the early Academy rather than the early Pythagoreans, it is clear that binary opposition was a central feature of presocratic cosmology, at least from the time of Heraclitus. Pairs of opposites also appear frequently in Orphic sources, beginning with the 5th century BC tablets from Olbia. For example, Tablet 2 includes the lines "peace, war, truth, falsehood," which immediately recall a famous Heraclitean fragment: "The guard is day-night, winter-summer, war-peace, satiety-hunger." Yet, a closer examination reveals a key difference. Heraclitus emphasizes unity, where each member of the pair is part of a whole in the deity, rather than a moral opposition. The Orphic text, in contrast, emphasizes duality. Peace and war are aligned with truth and falsehood, evoking a moral and cosmic distinction similar to Empedocles' theory of love and strife. If the reference to peace-war on Tablet 2 is interpreted as symbolizing opposing cosmic principles, the inscription can be seen as expressing a dualistic worldview. In this vision, generation and life on earth, which arise from division, are not only illusory but also associated with evil, while truth and goodness are linked to the immaterial and the otherworldly. According to this perspective, one's true identity resides not in the body but in the soul, which is immortal. These beliefs are expressed in a similarly concise and enigmatic manner in Tablets 1 and 3. Tablet 3 presents the pairs of opposites: falsehood, truth, body-soul, symbolizing the soul's primacy over the body and the inferiority of the mortal, embodied condition, which obscures the initiate's true immortal, divine nature expressed by the soul. One might even interpret this as suggesting that the body apprehends only falsehood through sense perception, whereas the soul apprehends truth, perhaps through Dionysian ecstasis or mystical cognition, a sentiment that resonates with Platonic and Parmenidean thought, though this remains speculative. Tablet 1 reads, "Life-death, life-truth," referring to the belief in the soul's immortality. Considering the eschatological and soteriological importance of memory in the Orphic context, it is possible that truth is intended in the etymological sense of lack of forgetfulness, making the formula not only a declaration of the mystic truth that the initiate experiences life after death, but also an allusion to the role of memory in securing this post-mortem existence. The text could thus be understood as, from life to death to life. This is the truth: life leads to death, but again to new life. A later gold tablet from Paulina in Thessaly, shaped like an ivy leaf and dated roughly a century later, reads, "Now you have died, and now, thrice happy one, you have been born on this very day." In this context, a reference to the cycle of reincarnation is less likely, given its negative connotations for the Orphics. Pairs of opposites also appear in the so-called Great Tablet from Thurii, whose enigmatic text has challenged scholars since its discovery. In line 5, a sequence of vocatives intermixed with seemingly meaningless letter groups, air, fire, mother, nestes, night, day, recalls similar noun sequences from other Orphic texts, including the hymn to Zeus and the Orphic oath preserved by Theon of Smyrna. The hymn to Zeus presents the god as containing the entire universe within himself, enumerating the physical and temporal elements that underlie reality, arranged as couples of opposites: fire and water, earth and air, night and day. The Orphic oath invokes the same elements in the same order, with minor variations. Air is replaced by sky, and night and day are represented by two equivalent pairs, namely moon and sun, and in inverted order, fans and night. If one examines line 5 of the Great Tablet, some of the previously mentioned elements, air, fire, night, and day, are immediately identifiable, while others, earth and water, are concealed behind the names of deities. Mother is the customary epithet for the goddess Earth, explicitly referenced in the first line of the text. Consequently, it is reasonable to identify the last name in the list, Nestes, with the missing element, water. This interpretation finds support in a fragment of Empedocles, where each of the four roots of all things is linked to a deity: bright Zeus, life-giving Hera, Hades, and Nestes, who moistens the mortal fountain with tears. Ancient commentators differ on whether Hera corresponds to earth and Hades, Hades to air or vice versa, yet they consistently interpret Zeus as fire and Nestes as water, the latter clearly described as such in the fragment. Based on this comparison, some scholars propose a further interpretation for the tablet. Air and fire represent Zeus and Dionysus Helios, respectively, while Mother Earth and Nestes correspond to Demeter and Persephone. Together with the primordial deities Night and Phans, Day, these figures form a central part of the Orphic pantheon. Regardless of the precise identification, the author of the Great Tablet appears to echo cosmological doctrines resembling those of Empedocles and the Dervini commentator. This might explain why the four elements are not presented as binary opposites, unlike in the hymn to Zeus and the Orphic Oath. Instead, the lighter elements, air and fire, associated with Olympian deities, appear first, followed by the heavier elements, earth and water, associated with chthonic deities. One might argue that binary thinking is not unique to the Orphics or certain Greek philosophers, but rather a feature inherent to human cognition. Even if humans are naturally predisposed to think in terms of binaries due to brain structure, the extent to which this tendency is emphasized clearly depends on cultural factors. In ancient Greece, a cultural shift around the turn of the 5th century BC fostered a dualistic view of the individual, which in its most extreme expression led to the Orphic soul-body dichotomy, wherein the body is seen as an evil to be overcome. Within the Orphic context, binary opposition is more than a method for organizing reality. Formulas such as falsehood-truth and body-soul encapsulate the core of the Orphic worldview. They express the distinction between the illusion of mortal existence and the eternal life that the initiate seeks after death, carrying profound religious and metaphysical significance. In this framework, the preeminence of night is mirrored by air's primacy over fire in the author's cosmology. The cosmogony appears to begin with air and fire, from which other forms of matter subsequently emerge. This dualistic scheme closely resembles accounts from Diodorus of Eritrea and Aristoxenus, who report that Pythagoras received his teachings from Zorotas, Zoroaster. Within this system, sexual distinctions, father-mother, are expressed through the light-dark opposition, corresponding to the ether-night pair, while also reflecting fundamental physical opposites: hot-cold, dry-moist, light-heavy, and swift-slow. Plato absorbed the dualistic worldview of the Orphics and used it as the foundation for his understanding of human nature and cognition. This dualism rests on the opposition between a rational, immortal, and divine principle, which reaches toward the realm of eternal and absolute truth, and a chaotic, mortal, material principle, which drags in the opposite direction toward baseness, mindlessness, and falsehood. By means of his theory of forms, Plato extended this dualistic framework to the structure of the universe, reflecting a symmetry between microcosm and macrocosm that permeates his thought. In Platonic ontology, contrary to all earlier schools except perhaps Pythagoreanism, sensible reality derives its essence not from matter, but from eternal, unchanging substances which exist independently of the phenomena in which they are manifested. These entities, called things in themselves or forms, are the true objects of knowledge, which is not gained through experience or the senses, but recovered through recollection, a process made possible by the inherent affinity between the human soul and these perfect, immutable realities. Plato's dualism, however, is nuanced, and the same is true of his ontology. In the Phaedo and the Republic, binary opposition serves as a tool for understanding the forms, yet the two sides of each binary are not equal in ontological status. In pairs such as good and evil, justice and injustice, beauty and ugliness, only the first element exists fully, while the second exists only as its negation. The phenomena themselves derive from the forms and occupy an intermediate position between being and non-being, in the realm of becoming. Thus, Plato's mature ontology is dualistic in positing a distinction between forms and their instances, but the basis of this distinction, namely, that only the forms exist absolutely, whereas phenomena exist in a derivative sense, shows that his philosophy was not dualistic in the rigid sense of Zoroastrianism. A close parallel with the Orphics is evident. For them, the split between spiritual and material, immortal and mortal, mirrors the division between truth and falsehood. Truth, goodness, and knowledge belong to the realm of the gods and purified souls, while evil, appearance, and ignorance reside in the material world, which impure souls are compelled to inhabit. Analogy is one of the methods most frequently employed by Plato when addressing the theory of forms. Throughout the dialogues, he makes extensive use of similes, metaphors, and analogies, often drawn from everyday human activities. The Republic, in particular, offers a rich collection of such images. Among them, the well-known analogies of the sun, the divided line, and the cave, presented across a long section extending from the end of Book 6 to the beginning of Book 7, are central to understanding Plato's metaphysical and epistemological views. Of these, the allegory of the cave has become especially famous, though this prominence is somewhat misleading, as it is also one of the most debated passages, both because of its own interpretive difficulties and because of the challenge of reconciling it with the analogies of the sun and the line. Since Plato himself indicates that the cave should be understood in relation to the preceding images, it is necessary first to consider briefly the analogies of the sun and the divided line before turning to the cave. The analogy of the sun is intended to clarify the nature of the good, described as the greatest object of study, by reference to which all that is just and proper must be evaluated. Given the difficulty of addressing such a subject directly, especially within the limits of written discourse, Socrates declines to define the good itself, and instead agrees to speak about what appears to be its offspring and closest likeness, namely the sun. Returning to the comparison between knowledge and vision, he notes that sight, unlike the other senses, depends on a third element that allows it to function: light. Because the sun is the source of light, it can be regarded as the cause of vision. In a similar way, the good enables the soul to know the forms by granting them truth and being, just as the sun makes visible objects perceptible by illuminating them. However, just as light and vision are not identical with the sun, even though they depend on it, knowledge and truth are not identical with the good, but remain distinct from it. Since the good is the cause of both knowledge and truth, it must be considered knowable. Yet, as beautiful as knowledge and truth are, the good surpasses them and stands apart as something even greater. One interpretation of this claim suggests that the good should be treated as an object of knowledge while still recognizing its unique status among such objects. A stronger interpretation, however, proposes that although the good may appear to be an object of knowledge, it ultimately transcends knowledge altogether. This reading gains support from the parallel drawn between the good and the sun. Just as the sun not only makes things visible, but also sustains their growth and existence without itself being identical with existence, so too the good grants intelligible things both their knowability and their being, while itself remaining beyond essence, exceeding it in dignity and power. Additional support for the stronger interpretation appears in Socrates' own admission that he possesses only opinions about the good rather than genuine knowledge, which explains his reliance on metaphor and allegory. This statement does not entirely exclude the possibility that others, such as the philosopher-rulers of an ideal city, might in principle attain such knowledge. However, it should at least temper any excessive confidence on the reader's part. In any case, it is not difficult to see why Plato might have been reluctant to assert openly that, just as the good is the source of essence while also standing beyond it, so too knowledge and truth derive from the good, even though it surpasses them both. Even if the practical unknowability of the good is already implied in the comparison with the sun, which, although visible, cannot be directly looked at in the same way as other objects, and thus remains in a sense beyond ordinary vision, drawing too much attention to this feature would risk undermining the purpose served by the analogies of the sun, the line, and the cave within that part of the dialogue, and within the broader philosophical argument. Leaving aside more unconventional readings, the central meaning of the sun analogy remains relatively clear. The sun functions as an illustrative comparison to clarify the role of the good in relation to the forms. Just as the sun sustains life and enables sight in the visible world, the good grants essence to the forms and renders them intelligible to the human mind. Yet the final claim of the analogy has long provoked debate. Socrates' description of the good as being beyond essence is deliberately obscure, prompting further inquiry from Glaucon. In response, Socrates develops the comparison by introducing a visual model that represents the relationship between the visible and intelligible realms. He asks the reader to imagine a line divided into two unequal sections, each corresponding to a different degree of clarity and truth. The shorter portion represents the visible realm, while the longer one corresponds to the intelligible domain. Each of these sections is then divided again according to the same proportion. Within the visible section, the larger subsection represents physical objects, while the smaller corresponds to their shadows and reflections, that is, images of visible things. In the intelligible section, the larger subsection represents the forms themselves, while the smaller corresponds to the kinds of mental constructs used by those engaged in disciplines such as geometry and arithmetic. As Socrates explains, the purpose of this analogy is primarily epistemological. Each of the four divisions corresponds to a distinct cognitive state, arranged according to the degree of clarity associated with its object. At the highest level stands intelligence, followed by thinking, then belief, and finally illusion. The question of how one ascends to the highest level of understanding is addressed through the allegory of the cave. The reader is invited to imagine prisoners who have spent their entire lives confined within an underground cave, chained in such a way that they can only look forward, unable to turn their heads. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners there is a raised path along which others carry various crafted objects, hidden from view by a barrier. The shadows cast by these objects are projected onto the wall before the prisoners, who take them to be the only reality they know. If one of these prisoners were released and compelled to turn around, he would initially find the objects themselves less real than the shadows. If he were then dragged outside into the sunlight, he would be overwhelmed by the brightness and temporarily blinded. Gradually, however, his sight would adjust. First he would perceive shadows and reflections, then real objects, and finally he would be able to look upon the sun itself. Once released, the prisoner comes to understand that what he had previously taken to be true, namely, the shadows within the cave, were nothing more than images, indeed reflections of realities existing outside. The general meaning of the allegory is made explicit by Socrates near the end of the passage, where he explains that each element of the image corresponds to what has already been described. The cave represents the visible realm as it appears through sight, while the firelight within it stands in for the power of the sun. Likewise, the upward journey and the vision of the things above signify the ascent of the soul toward the intelligible realm. In this way, the allegory is meant to illustrate the movement from perception to understanding, while the broad correspondence between the cave and the lower portion of the divided line, representing the visible world, and between the outside world and the upper portion, representing the intelligible domain, is generally accepted. Greater difficulty arises when one examines the details more closely. A central issue concerns whether the four cognitive states outlined in the analogy of the line correspond precisely to stages within the cave allegory. According to the traditional view, the prisoner's initial condition reflects illusion. The freed prisoner's recognition of the statues corresponds to belief. His observation of shadows and reflections outside the cave aligns with thinking, and his direct vision of real objects represents intelligence. However, the challenge of aligning the objects of cognition in the lower sections of the line with those in the early stages of the cave, among other complications, has led some interpreters to question this parallel. Further debate surrounds the symbolic meaning of particular elements within the allegory, especially the figures of the puppeteers and, above all, the prisoners themselves. Much discussion has focused on Socrates' remark that the prisoners are like us, since the interpretation of the entire image depends heavily on how this comparison is understood. Some of the difficulties in interpreting the allegory arise from the expectation that symbolic language should exhibit the same precision as formal philosophical discourse, while others stem from the inherent ambiguity of the imagery, which invites multiple readings. In order to clarify the meaning of the allegory, it is helpful to consider its possible origins. Given the richness and complexity of the cave image, it is reasonable to distinguish between two levels of interpretation, one more accessible to a general educated audience, and another more esoteric, perhaps intended for those more deeply engaged with Plato's philosophy. On the more accessible level, scholars have pointed to several well-known caves in the Greek world as possible sources of inspiration. Among these, a particularly striking parallel can be found in the cave of Trophonius at Lebedia in Boeotia, an important oracular site in antiquity. According to the account of Pausanias, who claims first-hand experience, those seeking consultation at this site underwent a series of ritual preparations. After purification and sacrifice, they were required to drink from the water of forgetfulness in order to clear their minds, followed by the water of memory so that they might retain what they were about to witness. They then descended into the cave itself, lying down while holding offerings in their hands. The experience that followed was described as profoundly transformative, resembling a visionary journey akin to the account of the cosmos presented in the myth of air. The presence of the waters of forgetfulness and memory, also prominent in Orphic descriptions of the afterlife, suggests that this descent into the cave was not merely an act of consultation, but bore the character of a symbolic death and rebirth. In this respect, it closely parallels the initiation rituals associated with Orphic and Eleusinian traditions. Another likely source of inspiration for the cave allegory, one that Plato's audience would have readily recognized, lies in the Orphic and Eleusinian mysteries, where light played a central role. Rituals involving torches were a defining feature of the Eleusinian ceremonies, and the revelation of a great light marked the climax of initiation rites both at Eleusis and at Samothrace. In this context, the suggestion that the procession of images within the fire-lit cave reflects the display of sacred objects during torch-lit initiation rituals appears entirely plausible. If, as some have argued, fire and torchlight in these rites symbolically evoked sunlight, then the connection becomes even more compelling, since the fire within the cave is itself meant to represent the sun. Within the framework of the mysteries, initiation often involved a powerful emotional progression, beginning with distress or fear, sometimes even a symbolic anticipation of death, and culminating in a sense of release and illumination. Such experiences have been described as a kind of rehearsal of death, a symbolic descent and return that prepared the initiate for the afterlife. Since Plato frequently employs the language and imagery of initiation as a metaphor for philosophy, it is reasonable to see the moment when the freed prisoner first observes the artificial objects in the firelight as analogous to the initial stage of revelation in the mysteries. At the same time, the allegory also draws on other aspects of Athenian culture. The puppet-like display inside the cave evokes theatrical performance, representing the lowest level of cognition, while the figures carrying the objects likely symbolize cultural producers, especially poets, unless they are simply part of the narrative framework. Up to this point, the interpretation remains largely in line with common scholarly views, but further analysis introduces more controversial considerations. Before turning to a deeper, more esoteric reading of the allegory, some general conclusions may be drawn. Whereas the analogies of the sun and the line are primarily concerned with questions of being and knowledge, the cave allegory focuses more directly on social and political conditions. Its purpose is to depict the state of ignorance, or lack of education, in which most people live, and to illustrate the process by which they might be led out of it. This process closely resembles initiation. It involves confusion, resistance, and the rejection of familiar comforts and inherited beliefs. The initial stage requires abandoning conventional opinions about matters such as justice in favor of more reliable, first-hand understanding. This corresponds to the level of belief, which concerns real instances rather than mere appearances or imitations, such as those found in poetic representation. The next stage involves a transition from the world of opinion to the intelligible realm, achieved through the study of mathematics, which serves as a necessary preparation for grasping higher truths. The final stage is the contemplation of the good itself. Yet the journey does not end there. The return to the cave is as difficult as the ascent. The philosopher, now accustomed to abstract reasoning, appears confused or even mad to others, and any attempt to guide them toward philosophy may provoke hostility, even to the point of death, recalling the fate of Socrates. Despite this seemingly discouraging outcome, the allegory of the cave remains, as has often been observed, one of the most hopeful and striking expressions of Plato's confidence in the transformative power of philosophy. At the same time, it appears to stand in tension with other passages in which Plato expresses doubt that the soul, while still bound to the body, can ever fully attain knowledge of the forms. To resolve this apparent contradiction, it becomes necessary to consider a deeper level of interpretation. Some scholars have already pointed in this direction by emphasizing the otherworldly dimension of the cave. The association with the realm of the dead, suggested by its underground setting, is reinforced when Socrates, invoking the words of Achilles, compares life within the cave to a kind of death, implying that true life begins only with the soul's liberation from illusion. If the cave in Plato's allegory is understood as analogous to the underworld, then the experience of the freed prisoner may be interpreted as an ascent, a movement upward that reverses the traditional descent into the realm of the dead. In Greek tradition, journeys to the underworld were attributed not only to gods and heroes, such as Dionysus, Heracles, and Theseus, but also to certain exceptional mortals, including Pythagoras and Zalmoxis. Among these narratives, one of the most renowned is the descent of Orpheus, who, according to later accounts, underwent a profound transformation after returning from the underworld and turned toward the worship of Apollo as a solar deity. In a similar way, the freed prisoner in the cave allegory undergoes a kind of conversion, coming to recognize the good, symbolized by the sun, as the ultimate cause of all that is right and beautiful, as well as the true source of truth and reason. The allegory of the cave can also be seen as anticipating the myth of air at the conclusion of the dialogue. The parallels between the two narratives are striking. Just as air is granted a vision of the cosmic order, the liberated prisoner eventually beholds the heavenly bodies, the stars, the moon, and finally the sun itself. Moreover, air's return to life finds a counterpart in the prisoner's descent back into the cave. Both figures, having witnessed a higher reality, are entrusted with a task: to communicate what they have seen and, if possible, to guide others toward liberation. For the freed prisoner, this means attempting to release his former companions and lead them out of their confinement, since any condition would be preferable to the ignorance in which they remain. The underlying message of the allegory, that life within the realm of opinion, or the physical world, resembles a kind of death, closely reflects Orphic beliefs, as evidenced both in Platonic texts and in ritual traditions. Plato refers more than once to the notion, associated with Orphic thought, that the body serves as a tomb or prison for the soul. This idea appears in various contexts, including discussions that connect it with myths of punishment and purification, as well as with the imagery of confinement. In the cave allegory, these two metaphors, the body as tomb and as prison, are effectively brought together into a single image. Such imagery expresses a worldview that diminishes the value of present, embodied existence in comparison with the promise of a truer and better life beyond death. For the Orphic initiate, death was not something to fear, but rather a passage to a higher state, the eternal life of the purified soul, in contrast to the deceptive and transient life associated with the body. This perspective, which equates earthly existence with captivity or even death, finds a clear parallel in Plato's philosophy, where the visible and physical world is consistently regarded as inferior to the invisible and intelligible realm of the forms, a distinction that lies at the core of his thought. Given the central importance of the cave image within Plato's philosophy, it is worth asking whether similar imagery appears elsewhere in his works. In fact, another passage presents the world of the living in terms reminiscent of a cave, and it is found, unsurprisingly, in one of Plato's eschatological myths, namely the concluding myth of the Phaedo. After describing the hollow within the earth where human beings dwell and contrasting it with the region above, Plato explains that the earth contains many such cavities, varying in depth and width, which together form the different regions of the underworld. The resemblance between this description and the cave allegory is difficult to overlook. The long entrance of the cave recalls those deeper hollows with narrower openings mentioned in the Phaedo. Even if this similarity were not intended as a direct reference, the consistency of Plato's eschatological imagery across different dialogues invites a comparison between the two accounts. Since the cave allegory itself carries an implicit connection to themes of death and the afterlife, it is reasonable to suppose that both passages may ultimately derive from a shared source of inspiration. One possible origin, as some have suggested, is a lost Orphic Pythagorean allegorical poem, which may also have influenced Empedocles, where the material world is likewise depicted as a kind of cave. Although one might object that, if a strict parallel were intended, the cave in the Republic should correspond exactly to the human dwelling described in the Phaedo, this does not undermine the comparison. The condition of the prisoners in the cave is presented as analogous to that of ordinary human life, yet it is clearly exaggerated in order to emphasize its symbolic meaning. In this sense, the cave of the allegory is more intensely otherworldly than the human habitat described in the Phaedo, which makes it entirely appropriate that it should be imagined as deeper and more remote. There are, therefore, strong reasons to believe that the imagery of the cave allegory ultimately reflects an Orphic eschatological perspective, according to which life on earth resembles a state of death, while true life can only be attained after the soul is freed from the body. If this connection between the cave and the Phaedo myth is accepted, further parallels emerge. Interpreting the cave as one of the subterranean hollows described in the Phaedo suggests that the world outside the cave corresponds to the true earth, the realm in which purified souls reside between incarnations. In the Phaedo, it is said that human beings live within a hollow of the earth, mistakenly believing it to be the surface, and that the air they perceive as the sky is not the true sky at all. Only someone capable of enduring the vision would recognize the genuine sky, light, and earth. This description closely mirrors the experience of the freed prisoner, who, upon emerging from the cave, is at first unable to endure the brightness of the outside world. The similarity reinforces the idea that both passages describe the same underlying structure of reality. Moreover, Plato himself appears to suggest that the world beyond the cave represents a realm of post-mortem reward, when he remarks that those who devote themselves entirely to the pursuit of knowledge may come to believe that, even while alive, they have already been transported to a blessed state, a condition that ultimately distances them from ordinary civic life. The connection between heaven and the world of forms would not appear surprising to anyone acquainted with the central myth of the Phaedrus, where this identification is clearly expressed. In that account, true being is described as colorless, shapeless, and intangible, accessible only to the intellect, which guides the soul. Divine intelligence, nourished by reason and pure knowledge, contemplates truth and is sustained by it, beholding realities such as justice, temperance, and knowledge in their absolute form before returning again within the celestial order. Such contemplation constitutes the life of the gods. Yet this highest region, situated beyond the heavens and containing the supreme forms, remains accessible only to divine beings and to those souls that have entirely cast off their mortal elements. Beneath it lies a lower heavenly domain, corresponding to what is elsewhere described as the true earth, where virtuous souls reside between incarnations. Souls that have completed their earthly life undergo judgment. Some descend to places of punishment beneath the earth, while others, purified and guided by justice, are carried upward to dwell in a region befitting the life they previously led. When the allegory of the cave is reconsidered in light of these accounts, its apparent optimism regarding the human capacity to attain knowledge of the good and of the higher forms becomes more restrained. If the ascent from the cave truly represents the soul's movement toward the intelligible realm, then such a journey seems to extend beyond the limits of ordinary human existence. Even when interpreted figuratively, as an image of intellectual progress through mathematics and dialectic, the setting and imagery of the cave situate the process within a broader mystical and eschatological framework. Within this framework, the initial movement from shadows to visible objects corresponds to an initiatory experience, one that prepares the individual for death by loosening attachment to appearances. The further transition, from the sensible world to the intelligible realm, is then symbolically aligned with death itself. This interpretation accords with a wider tendency in Plato's thought to draw upon the language and concepts of mystery traditions in articulating his philosophical vision. Education, in its highest sense, is thus portrayed as a form of initiation, a liberation from the constraints of sensory experience, a purification of perception directed toward truth, and an elevation of the human spirit toward unity with the divine. This perspective clarifies why philosophy is described as an exercise of death. Since genuine knowledge arises from the contemplation of the forms and is fully accessible only to the soul when freed from the body, the philosopher seeks, even while alive, to minimize attachment to bodily concerns and to approach as closely as possible a state of separation from the material realm. The structure of the Republic itself reflects this idea. It begins with a descent and concludes with a narrative of return from the beyond, thereby framing the philosophical pursuit of knowledge as a fundamentally otherworldly undertaking. Within this broader design, the allegory of the cave stands at the center, encapsulating the movement from ignorance to truth as both an intellectual and a spiritual transformation. On the basis of these assumptions, if the image of the cave is interpreted through its Orphic background, and the ascent is understood as symbolizing the soul's escape from the prison of the body, that is, death, then several consequences follow. In the first place, the path toward enlightenment must be seen as extending across multiple lives. By awakening the latent memory of the forms embedded within the rational soul, individuals gradually accustom themselves to abstract thought through the study of mathematics, and eventually advance to the philosophical investigation of moral forms by means of dialectic. In this way, when the soul finally departs from the body, it is directed toward a higher and purer realm than the earthly one, where intelligible realities can be apprehended more directly. If, in subsequent incarnations, the soul makes wise choices and avoids excessive contact with forgetfulness, it may preserve part of the knowledge acquired both in previous lives and in the invisible realm. Through this continuity, the process of intellectual and spiritual development can continue until the soul becomes sufficiently purified to return to its original heavenly dwelling. This final transition, from the lower level of the intelligible domain, identified with the true earth, to the higher divine region beyond, is not represented in the allegory of the cave, since that narrative concerns the experience of one who turns to philosophy for the first time. Such an individual, according to this interpretation, may briefly contemplate the higher forms, and even the good itself, though only from a distance, before undergoing reincarnation once more. While this does not amount to the full contemplation enjoyed by completely purified souls, it nevertheless renews the philosopher's memory and grants an advantage over those who have not pursued philosophy. Even so, however close one may come to understanding the forms and their relation to the good, complete knowledge in the fullest sense remains beyond human reach, constrained by the limitations inherent in mortal existence. A further implication follows from this interpretation. The process of purification and enlightenment does not lie entirely within human control. If the passage from the sensible to the intelligible realm corresponds to death, then it is not something that individuals can choose at will, but rather something granted by divine will. Even the initial moment in the cave narrative, the freeing of the prisoner and the turning away from shadows toward reality, is attributed to the intervention of an external liberating force. This figure may be understood as representing divine influence or inspiration, which elsewhere is presented as the source of virtue among certain individuals and as the condition enabling the soul's ascent. Although such language might appear metaphorical or ironic to modern readers, it becomes more comprehensible when considered in relation to the kind of knowledge the philosopher seeks. In this context, the appeal to divine intervention reflects not a rhetorical flourish, but an acknowledgement of the limits of human capacity and a recognition of the higher source from which true insight ultimately derives. If the good is defined, as Plato presents it, as the unhypothetical principle from which all knowledge and truth ultimately derive, then to claim that a person could attain true knowledge of the good within a single lifetime would imply a transcendence of the human condition itself. To possess such complete knowledge would be to approximate the divine, yet this is not a claim Plato makes. On the contrary, he consistently stresses, both in the Republic and elsewhere, that philosophy is a lifelong pursuit. However close one may come to grasping true being, human understanding remains incomplete and never fully definitive. This perspective provides the proper context for interpreting the three analogies found in the central books of the Republic. It also explains why Plato avoids making explicit the more pessimistic implications embedded within the deeper, eschatological meaning of the cave allegory. To state openly that the educational program designed to lead future philosopher rulers toward knowledge of the good is only achievable in a limited sense would weaken the argument for the practical realization of the ideal state, and might even call into question the legitimacy of philosophical rule itself. For this reason, such considerations remain implicit, concealed beneath the surface of the dialogue, and accessible only to those capable of perceiving them.